going to pick up right. Announcement I want to make that last quarter, as you know, it's myself and Dr. Alley. This quarter is myself and Dr. Cleaver. And it's Dr. Cleaver supposed to be here with the projector. And Catlin, would you go in there in the agronomy office and call Dr. Cleaver and tell him you better get over here to the projector in a hurry, okay? A good way to start out. So we'll start out right where Dr. Alley left off. You remember he said he got up to the vine nursery and then had to stop. And I said, that's a good place to stop. So last quarter, you pruned all the vines, made all the cuttings, made your bench grafts, got everything all set to go. You're got the bench grafts, which we'll look at this afternoon, all ready to plant. Where are you going to plant them? So let's talk a little bit about the nursery, even though this, again, is in the textbook. And one of the things which I frequently tell this class is that so often the grower ignores the obvious and does something dumb. We're going to talk about the nursery, and I know of a nursery down in what's the big valley where they grow lettuce? Salinas Valley. Yeah, that a grower who planted a big nursery for several years in a sandy area and had nematodes on every rooting and never bothered to fumigate, and then dug these rootings and sold them a nice inoculation of nematodes on that what might be virgin soil. So the first thing that you worry about, regardless of anything else, is to make sure that you have a clean soil to plant the nursery. And I say that's the obvious. Let me tell you a real boner. One of the big wineries in the North Coast invested a lot of money in a completely new area. Did you get him? Okay. In a completely new area. And it's such a new area that they decided they could plant vines on their own roots. So they made 100,000 cuttings or so and buried them down by the old barn near the old wine vineyard. And very carefully and completely inoculated them all completely with phosphorus. And then dug them up and took them over and planted them. That's at Boonville, in case any of you are growing grapes at Boonville. But anyway, that's what they did. So the first thing you have to have is a clean soil. And that means usually today that you've got to fumigate it. And we'll talk about fumigation in great detail when we get to nematodes. But the point is that you should fumigate with methyl bromide, where you've seen sometimes with the tarps on, the plastic tarps. Or fumigate, deep fumigation with carbon bisulfide, or DD. So you use methyl bromide, or DD, or carbon bisulfide. I said we'll go into all this later on, so let's just say that you use those three right now. For fumigation of the nursery site. And all of these will cost you close to $400 an acre. And if you use methyl bromide, you have to wait. The waiting period now is 4 to 6 weeks with this, but it can be up to 4 to 6 months with these materials before you can plant. A delay, a waiting period for planting nursery, especially in these soils. Okay, now you've got the soil fumigated, but said I don't know which one should have come first, but what you need, of course, ideally for a nursery is a nice sandy, friable, which sometimes bothers the foreign students, friable, which means easily cultivated, friable soil. and because it has to be easily worked and to get good root development. And easily worked because certainly you're going to have more cultural operations in a young nursery than you're going to have in a mature vineyard. So that you have to irrigate it more frequently, cultivate it more frequently, so therefore you need sandy soil so that you can work it easier. And then one of the other things which is so obviously overlooked sometimes is that you must have a readily available water supply. I have seen places where people plant the nursery on the back side of their 160 acres at the absolute end of the irrigation line. Why not plant it right up by the well, where you turn on the water and irrigate with only 200 feet of line being filled with water instead of putting it on the far back corner of 160 acres. So a readily available water supply is a real must. Okay, on soil preparation, again, if you're going to go into the nursery business, you should do the deep plowing in the fall, in the late fall or late summer, before the winter rains start. You want to subsoil or plow 12 or 16 inches deep. You don't want to wait until a week from today to do this, because the soil is going to be wet and you go in with heavy equipment and you're going to compact it. So you go in the fall and do the deep plowing in the fall, and then in the spring all you do is just do a light plowing or disking or harrowing to get a good tilt so that you have a level surface and fairly fine cultured soil. Okay, we got the soil ready now, and on planting, remember that we've discussed all these ways that you can increase the percent take. That's careful selection, basal cuttings, early planting, soaking them in water before you plant them, and all this. So remember that. Okay, then it's a matter then of spacing them, and on spacing it depends almost entirely on what sort of equipment you've got to work with. That is, as far as the row spacing is concerned. As spacing the cuttings in the row, we usually place them about 4 inches apart. And here at Davis, we plant them 4 inches apart in the row and 4 feet between the rows. But that happens to be because that's what our equipment is. Now at 4 foot spacing and 3 inches between the cuttings, I don't know why I said 4 and then 4, but 4 foot spacing and 3 inches between the cuttings, you can plant enough in a 1 acre nursery to provide vines for 80 acres of planting. So on 1 acre nursery then should take care of 80 acres of planting of vines. Now if you're going to use these, if you're going to, once again, obviously if you're going to do whip grafting in place, not in the lab as you did with Dr. Alley, but if you're going to do this out in the nursery, you ought to plant these cuttings about 4, maybe up to 6 inches apart so that you can work with them, and a little bit higher out of the ground, of course, since you're going to graft them. So normally with cuttings, we will plant them with just 1 bud above the ground level. But if you're going to use rootstocks in the nursery and then whip graft them in place, you ought to leave about 4 inches above the ground so that you have something to work with, of course. Okay, now we have various and sundry ways of planting these things. And really, no matter what the text says and all this other business, the main thing to do is to get them in the ground, get the soil compacted around them firmly, and then irrigated as soon as possible. That's all of it in one sentence. But we have one of the things we sometimes do is use a subsoiler, and we keep talking about a subsoiler, but it's a long thing, which I'll show you here in a minute on the slides, which may go down about 24 inches. It has what we call a foot on the end of it, and then this rips through the soil and gives you a loose area down through here and breaks up the area down in this area here so that you can go along and shove the cuttings into the ground. Now we do this, Davis, and that's what you'll do, because after we make this long furrow of this type, we run water down it, and this becomes sort of a custard mud pudding, and then you can just shove the cuttings down in it and pull them up and down to where you get one bud just above the ground level. And then we go back in later and then cover this up. So you'll do this out in the lab. Another way of doing it, of course, is just to use a turning plow, which just throws soil out in this fashion with a straight side here, and then just put the cuttings, just line them up along in this fashion, and then throw the soil back on, and then turn the soil back, and in turning the soil back you make a furrow, and then just irrigate down the furrow. That's a pretty fast way to do it that way, but I've done them. I've planted them in a subsoil furrow that's bone dry, and then just plowed the soil back to them and irrigate immediately and get 90% take or so. So this is a matter of how you plant them is fairly simple to say, as long as you get them into the ground, the soil firmed around them, and water applied as soon as possible. Now, quite often the people raise the question whether or not you should apply nitrogen to nursery. And my comment has been that unless you're in practically pure sand, that you're better off not to apply nitrogen or any fertilizer at all. Why? Because in this first year, what you're after is a good root growth. And if you apply nitrogen, you'll get more emphasis on top growth, which you're going to cut off anyway. So really, you're better off if you do anything approaching an average soil condition, not to put on any nitrogen. And another reason, of course, would be that remember, you want the plant to become dormant and mature its what top growth you do have fairly early. And if you apply nitrogen, of course, you're going to get delayed maturity in the fall on the wood that you really want to keep. So normally we do not worry about nitrogen application in nursery. There's one thing that has come up, though, in the past few years, and I still haven't had time to check it out, is that we've had a lot of comments about the use of methyl bromide and the possibility of phosphorus deficiency. Normally, remember I told you in the fertilizer lectures that there are no known instances of phosphorus deficiency with vineyards, but this report has come in so frequently that we're beginning to wonder if there isn't some truth to it. So that where you use methyl bromide, there's something apparently about bromide and phosphorus that tends to cause a little deficiency of phosphorus in some nurseries. So we have not checked this out yet, but any of you do use methyl bromide in a nursery, you might, since the nursery is so valuable, you might want to put on a couple of 100 pounds of triple superphosphate or phosphate fertilizer, but certainly you don't need the nitrogen. Okay, then I think this time we could show the slides, and then it'll bring us up to where we want to be on this. So let's have the slides if we could. I guess it's easy. So a few of these slides to review. I want to catch paddings. It's still in sharp enough. But that's a nice sand bed to, gee, I'm getting dizzy. Okay. All right, that's where we start with the cuttings in a sand bed like that. Okay, the next slide. And these are the cuttings, as Dr. Ali told you about the right stage for planting. You see there's getting a few roots down here and a few buds at the top beginning to push. So now we're ready to plant the nursery. Okay, next slide.
Might have got mixed up. Tipped over.
Okay, they're ready to plant, but there's something wrong with that projector because they're all out of focus. Okay, this, to some of you who are not familiar with California agriculture, this happens to be methyl bromide fumigation, but this particular spot happens to be for strawberries. But the next one will show you grapes. And here is Napa Valley with one of these pieces of equipment. Now, this is a, okay, that's a nice shot now. And this setup here, if any of you went over to the grape fair in North Coast counties last week or 2 weeks ago, you saw this piece of equipment. And it's really set up because you can't see it. You can't see it here, but there's a plow on that side that covers up each edge of the soil, and one on this side that covers it up. And that's a methyl bromide fumigation equipment. Well, here's the plow up here in the air. It's turned up. And this is one way of treating it, and most of the Napa vineyards are being treated in this way to kill dagger nematode and weed seeds, if nothing else, morning glory seeds and what have you. But it costs us, say, about $400 an acre to apply this. Okay, next slide. Okay, this is the picture that's in your textbook, but this is in living color. And this is a VEN116 class planting cuttings, supposedly 4 inches apart, but sometimes people don't know what 4 inches is, so you see how close they're going in there. But that's a VEN116 class. You plant them. As I say, we made that subsoil furrow, put water in it, punch these things down, and then come back and cover it up. Now, Dr. Alley's work has shown that about half the time it pays to cover them, about half the time it doesn't. So his final conclusion was that if you're in a hot, windy area, it's probably better to cover them up. But under normal conditions, you're probably just as well off just to plant them with one bud above the soil level and then water them in and forget it. Okay, next slide. Can you focus it on? Okay. This is a nursery, a big nursery, about 5-acre nursery really in Mexico, but it gives you an idea what a nursery looks like in the summertime after you've planted just what you saw there, and then irrigate it in and forget it, and then this is what you get. And say you don't want too much top growth. This happens to be a very fertile soil area, and that top growth is really all you need if it just stopped right there. But of course this is about this is about the 1st of August or middle of July, so that if you could have that top growth stop right there, stop growing and just mature, be just what you wanted. Okay, next slide. And this is a slide you saw before on hand digging. You can either hand dig them, or the next slide, you've seen these, so we'll go through them. This is the equipment that you see out in the vineyard and have seen before for digging a nursery. So use that equipment to dig it. Can we have the next one then? And this is the equipment in action. See, it cuts the roots and lifts them and drops them so that you have them sitting essentially in loose soil so you can pull them up by hand. Okay, next slide. This you saw before. This is, as Dr. Alley says, these are monsters. They're not number ones, they're monsters. But this is the way they come up. You see, one of the things that you want to notice is that most of the rooting occurs at the nodes. Sometimes you get some roots like in this one that run just in a long straight line right down the wood, one right below the other. But generally speaking, you get your rooting at the base, at the nodes, and that's one reason why you decide whether or not you want a 2-node cutting, a 3-node cutting, or a 4-node cutting. It's also why you want to cut them off just below the node. One of the questions that Dr. Alley suggested that I put on the midterm was to draw a series of 16-inch cuttings. And what he's hoping you do is draw a 16-inch cutting and make it and cut it off about here to make your 16 inches. But remember, you want to cut it off just below the node because the rest of this will just decay and give you a source of fungus infection into that basal part of the vine. Okay, next slide. And this is just those same ones you saw before after they're trimmed up. This is the ideal way if you've got plenty of money and plenty of help to prune them back to about 8 inches. And then make a big hole with a shovel and plant them this way. You've got the ideal start, but most people in California cut all this off back to about 1 or 2 inches, and then frequently just, as I told you before, jet a hole into the ground and plant them that way. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's something else. Okay. May I have the last, please? Okay, so you've made the cuttings, you've made the bench grafts, you've planted the nursery, you've dug it, you're ready to plant. Now the question is, what about the soil? We're going to discuss soil and this temperature regions during the next hour or so that right now we want to go into Vineyard Soils. And really, I don't know what this should have been discussed along with the fertilizer lectures, but I sort of like to put it in this sequence here. So if you wonder why I didn't discuss Vineyard Soils at that time, I think it fits in better here. Now, over the world, grapes are grown in probably a greater variety of soils than any other crop you can think of. And let me give you a few examples. In Germany, the slide that you just saw there, and we'll show this series of slides after you get your notes, we have these extremely steep hillsides, as you just saw. And before I ever went to Germany, I wondered how in the world they keep that soil from eroding down into the valley. Well, when you get over there, you find out it isn't soil. It's just broken up slate. It's just a mass of little flat pieces about ½ an inch square or so, and it's just a sand culture or a slate culture, so that the water doesn't wash it off. The water just goes down through it. So this is why I found out about it. But still, they do get a little bit of erosion, and they put it in. They put it in those picking baskets in the wintertime and tote it back up the hill. They do. They use those picking baskets in the fall to pick grapes, and then in the winter they use them to carry the soil back up the hill, which sort of gets to you. But anyway, that's what it is. So it's really not a soil. Okay, now that's one extreme. Now you can go to France, just 200 miles away, and there they've got a very heavy clay in the Champagne area, a very heavy clay sitting on what really is nothing but chalk. Just this stuff here. And many of the vineyard soils in France then run 50 to 60% calcium carbonate. And this is also true in parts of Spain, where in the Almeria area, they run as high as 2/3 chalk, nothing but calcium carbonate. And over in Sicily, while we're skipping around, you can go to Sicily, and there they grow them in volcanic ash. But in Australia, in South Africa, in California, we usually have pretty average type soils, mostly alluvial, which means they've been washed out of the hills, alluvial soils. But even here in California, our vineyard soils, even in California, can vary from the very heaviest clays to almost pure sand. And to give you examples, in Napa Valley, we have the most common soil in Napa Valley is what we call bale loam. Bale loam. And this runs 80% silt and clay. Silt and clay. Or you can go to Coachella Valley. And in Coachella Valley, the Coachella fine sand is 3%. 3% clay and silt. So Coachella fine sand, that's what it's written in the Coachella fine sand, runs 3% silt and clay. Or you can go to Livermore Valley, where we have 30% silt and clay. And quite a bit of gravel and small rocks, which Wendy likes to say, and so do Concanons, it's a little bit like the Bordeaux soils of Bordeaux, France. So the whole point of the examples that I'm giving you is that soil doesn't make a big difference about what you need for growing grapes. What I'm going to tell you this afternoon is that it's the climate, not the soil. The grapevine only wants a uniform texture. It really will object. It can be uniform texture of gravel, or it can be uniform texture of clay. What it doesn't want is a layer of clay, and then all of a sudden a layer of sand, or vice versa. The grapevine roots really object to a sudden transition.
Is the texture of heavy clay the same as chalk in France, or therefore a slow transition in France? Because you said that in France it was common to have heavy clay on top of chalk.
Yeah.
I wonder if they're the same.
No, in this case, in France, the roots just stop when they get to that chalk, or they don't go into it very much. So essentially the depth of the soil is only down as far as that goes. And then it gets into this limestone. Now, in Spain, you don't have that sudden transition. You just have the high amount of lime. So the roots still will penetrate and grow in it, but you've got to have special rootstocks. Remember, one of the reasons for grafting that Dr. Alley gave you was for soil conditions, and he talked about Berlandieri and 41B and so on. And this is why you have to have those special stocks. What he did not tell you about Berlandieri, Vitis Berlandieri, was that it is a native to eastern Texas, in an area perhaps 100 miles square, and very high limestone soils. And any plant, of course, native to that type of situation can tolerate it. So that's where we got the source of Berlandieri for the rootstocks of France and Spain and so on, where they do have high lime. But anyway, then, as I say, I really want to make a point about this business of the transition, because it's one of the problems they run into in the Salinas Valley. In the Salinas Valley, of course, for years and years and years, they've grown annual crops. And they didn't worry about the depth down to more than about 3 feet. And then they come in to plant grapes, and they didn't worry about it, they just planted them. And then we run into quite a few problems when the grapes get down to this transition zone. And in that area, it's a clay zone. It's a clay zone, and it may be only 6 inches thick or 12 inches thick, and then you go back into a regular type of soil. But when the roots reach that 12 inches, reach that clay, they won't penetrate, except through cracks. I took pictures, so if I don't have those, occasionally they'll find a crack and go down through the crack to the soil below. But even though this may sound unnecessary, or that why the vine should reject it, we don't know. But boy, if you're going to buy land in Salinas Valley, and the latest growers in that area found this out, they spend $300 or $400 an acre subsoiling down 40 inches deep in 2 directions like this, in order to break it up and try to get a mixture of this clay and sand layers, or sand and clay layers. Yes?
If the grapes were started out in the clay and hasn't passed through the initial other soil, would they grow in the clay? Are you saying there's some effect, there's a transition effect that causes the roots, causes some...
That's right. It's a transition effect.
And so suppose you kind of put these holes, put the roots down in those holes, and they started out in the clay, but they then, would you have vine growing?
You mean instead of subsoiling, just auger, huh?
Yeah.
Well, that'd be all right if you auger it all the way through. But it's this transition zone that is so difficult for the vine to adjust to. And I'm not sure that that's so unusual. One of the little stories I like to tell people to give you a little food for thought is, had it ever occurred to you why you can go into a cave with wet soil all around you and the water doesn't drip straight on down? Let me illustrate. Okay, here's a mountain and here's a cave, and in there, and you're going, how come the water doesn't come right on down through here? If it's raining up here, how come the water doesn't come right on through that cave? How come it goes around? Well, it's surface tension, of course, and this is part of the plant, the idea of the plant, that wherever you have this interface set up, you're going to run into interface tension problems. But this is one that I sometimes shake people up a little bit with. Okay, now we're going to talk about, I said that the main thing then about soils is that the grapevine doesn't care too much about what type of soil it has. It's interested in the physical texture, not nutrition, but physical texture. And then the main thing is the temperature. This is what determines where grapes really grow well, is temperature, and we're going to harp on that for about the next lecture and a half. And soil temperature depends on soil color, in part. It depends on several points. I'll name about 3 of them here, but one of them is soil color. That is, a black or a dark soil will absorb heat more efficiently than will a light sandy soil. And secondly, it depends, soil temperature depends on soil moisture. Now, you say soil moisture, okay. Remember this. That the specific heat of water is 1 calorie per gram. But the specific heat of a dry soil is only 0.2 calories per gram. And the specific heat of 20% moisture in a soil goes up to 1/3 of a calorie, roughly. And the specific heat of one with 30% moisture goes up to 0.38 calories per gram. So that the lighter the soil you have, the quicker it can warm up in the spring, and the easier or quicker growing conditions you can get. Now, we have talked in this class, I have repeatedly, about how we have such a long growing season, and we don't worry about losing 6 inches of growth or 12 inches of growth because we've got a long growing season. But in Europe, with a short growing season, you have got to account for try to get as much growth as you can possibly get. And this means that you pick the best slopes with the best drainage and the darkest soils and so on to get the longest maximum growing period you can get. And it is this which determines wine quality. It's not the nature of the soil itself, it's the exposure and all the factors that go to giving you a prolonged growing period, to give you the valuable soils in Europe. Remember, you're growing the grapes in the coolest area you can grow them in to get high quality. But then within that area, you've got to foster or nurture every possibility you can to prolong the growing season with a short maturing rootstock, good drainage soils, good exposure to the east, and say good drainage, and this gravelly soil or this slate soil that the Germans have in the Moselle Valley. In the Moselle Valley, which winds like a snake like this all the way down, and I mean just like that, you can have a vineyard on one side of the valley where the wine is worth $25 a bottle. You can have one on the other side where it's worth $2 a bottle, depending on the exposure that you get and the drainage and so on for the variety. And I'm not exaggerating. I've eaten in a restaurant where the wine, this was 10 years or more ago, where the wine was $25 a bottle because it had the best exposure and good drainage. Okay, let's look at a few of these soils, and then I'll let you out. This is the most, well, that first slide, Mark.
This was the first one.
No, the one that was in before you, yeah. Now, okay, this is the Moselle Valley, and this is Berncastle, and this is the Moselle River, and one of these vineyards sitting over here in the middle is where the $100 or the $100 mark, $25 bottle of wine comes from, and you can see how these vineyards. When I tell people you can fall out of a German vineyard, and you can. Now remember also what I've told you, that most of these German vineyards, over half the vineyards of Germany, the ownership of over half the vineyards of Germany is less than 2.5 acres each. Most of the ownerships then are less than a hectare. And the land is so precious and so expensive that you don't have a big fence and a row of trees and so forth between the vineyards. It's just your row ends here and the next guy's row begins right next to it. So this is very typical of the Rhine Valley and the Moselle Valley. Each of these being little different parcels owned by different people. Now, while we got this, I'll explain that this is why when they get close to the harvest season, the city fathers decide what day it is that you can no longer go into your vineyard before harvest. And then they decide what day you can all go in to pick your grapes. Because once you get right close to harvest, with these things being worth what they are, you might sneak over here and pick a row off this guy's, or a few boxes off this guy's vineyard. Okay, next slide. Okay, that's a long-range view. Here's a view looking in a vineyard, looking right down toward the valley floor. And although, you know, one of the things I like about this room, it's big enough, but the other thing I don't like about it is the way the light comes in from the side and you can't see. But I'm standing up the top of this vineyard, and right down at the bottom of the vineyard, about a block away, is a telephone pole, which you can't even see. So that shows you how steep this thing drops off, and you can also get some idea of the texture of the soil, which is nothing but, I say, broken up slate. Also, the fact that the vines are only about 3 feet by 4 feet apart in that area. Okay, next slide. Now, I talked about the lime soils of France. And what you don't know is that those lime soils continue under the channel, under the North Channel over to England and into England. And all of you are too young to remember the song, The White Cliffs of Dover, but these are the White Cliffs of Dover. And this same chalk formation goes under the North Sea and over into Belgium and into France. And then the soil sits on, what soil there is, sits on top of those white chalks. Okay, next slide. Now, we also have soil problems here in California. This is hardpan, and I'll bring in some real examples in this afternoon's lecture to show you what it is, but this is down in Madeira, and we have soil formations here in which, down about 3 feet or so, we run into what I refer to as underground sidewall. And that's just what it is. You can take a soil tube or something, and when you hit that, it just rings, like you'd hit cement. And this can be 12 inches down, it can be 6 feet down. It can be an inch or so thick, or it can run into 12 or 18 inches in thickness. And this is a situation where we're running out of time for right now, but I'll start over this afternoon with it. If it's only 2 or 3 inches thick, then you can use big subsoilers and a couple of big D9 tractors over to pull it and break it up. And if you break it up in the vine row and then carry it out, then you can plant the vines and the roots will go down underneath it. But you have to break it up. You can't just use dynamite as they used to do and blow it apart. You have to dig out sections of it in order to keep it from resealing. Okay, is there another slide in this? Yeah. And this is just another scene showing you a lot of it been piled up by hand alongside the roadway down, as say, in Madera area. Okay, I think it, okay. Now, this is one of the interesting slides that I like to show. If any of you have ever gone over to Napa Valley by way of Monticello Dam, you've probably seen, well, if you're interested, if you're farmers, you've noticed the cuts alongside the road. And one of the interesting things over in this area between here and Napa and all that range of hills is the depth of the surface soil. Now, see here, this is really about 6 or 8 feet deep in nice, good soil. And I was just over there last week or so, and I saw a lot of cuts 20 feet down in which you had nice, uniform soil. So that if we just had water for those hills, we'd be in business, because the soil is a good, deep soil in most of that area. And I think that's it, isn't it? Okay, I was supposed to ask one question, which I had a phone call about just before class. And that is, as all of you know, 116A was teletaped, and this course is being teletaped by Gallows. And the question has come up among several of the students of whether or not we want it teletaped or not. Does it bother any of you to have this teletape going or not? They wanted that on it, by the way. They wanted the discussion on your teletape. So is there any objection or any feeling about the lectures being teletaped?
There's more room in here.
There's more room, it's a little better. Okay, then we'll stay with it, because they called up and asked if it's okay to teletape it, and I said, well, I'll ask the class. So it's okay. All right, we'll have indoor lecture this afternoon, remember. Also tomorrow, all this